Good evening, and welcome to our final program of 2020. My name is Jake Begard, and I serve as Program Manager of the Common Ground Initiative in the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center, Gleaves Whitney and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and Brooke Clement and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, thank you for joining us for our last program of the semester. Our event format this evening will begin with a leadership minute from Grace Branding, followed by an introduction of our speaker for the evening by Brooke Clement. Mr. Pipes will speak for about 30 minutes, after which Gleaves Whitney will join him for a question and answer portion. So please use the Zoom toolbar at the bottom to submit questions as they come to mind. And a side note, applications for the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy open on Monday, December 14th. So if you know a student leader, or if you yourself are a student leader who would benefit, encourage them to apply. Applications can be found at gvsu.edu/HC. Speaking of student leaders, I would like to now introduce Grace Branding, a second-year student in the Leadership Academy set to graduate next week with a bachelor's degree in liberal studies. Please help me welcome Grace.
Thank you so much, Jacob, and welcome everyone to the event this evening. It's so nice to see you all here. As Jacob said, I'm in my second year as a Cook Leadership Academy Fellow and in my final semester as a student at Grand Valley. Last fall, in the fall of 2019, I was able to engage in the University of Michigan's partnership program with Grand Valley called Semester in Detroit. And while I was in Detroit, I was able to work in the city, live in the city, and learn lots of things. I interned at the James and Grace Lee Boggs School, and while I was there, I was able to learn lots about James and Grace Lee Boggs. James and Grace were community organizers, community leaders, philosophers, and activists in the city of Detroit in the second half of the 20th century. And I said I learned a lot about them, but the one thing that really stuck with me was their idea about radical reimagination. Radical reimagination is about creating unique solutions to messy problems. It's about removing the, I don't know, or that's never going to work from your mental vocabulary. It's about envisioning the health and vitality of our communities without limitation. And it's about making that imagination and vision a reality. Now, I don't have to tell you all know, we have a lot of messy problems going on in our world right now. We're living through a global pandemic. Police brutality continues to plague communities of color. There's an economic crisis. Millions are struggling to avoid eviction, water shutoffs, and just struggling to survive. So we've got a lot of messy problems. So I'd like to invite you all as leaders to engage in this work of radical reimagination, just as James and Grace and their ideology have invited me to engage in this work. Because we're at a critical moment here, and I think by using our ability to radically reimagine, we can create the types of communities we want to see as leaders. There's one other quote that Grace Lee Boggs had, and as I said, I worked at the James and Grace Lee Boggs School, and all of the students at the school, they had matching t-shirts with this quote on the back. And that is, we are the leaders that we've been looking for. So again, I'd like to take this moment to invite you all and remind you all that myself and you all are the leaders that we have been looking for now more than ever. I'd now like to pass it to Brooke Clement, the acting director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. To you, Brooke.
Thank you, Grace. Tonight, we are welcoming back noted historian Casey Pipes. His new book, After the Fall, The Remarkable Comeback of Richard Nixon, offers a glimpse inside the complexities of Nixon's post-presidential years. Following his resignation in 1974, Nixon redefined the role of a former president. For 20 years, Nixon served as an advisor, trusted confidant, and statesman for each of his predecessors. Casey Pipes began his career in 1995 as an intern in the office of former President Ronald Reagan. Pipes served as a speechwriter and a policy research manager for the George W. Bush administration and as an advisor to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. He now serves as the Norris Fellow at the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College and as a political commentator for Fox News Channel, Bloomberg TV, and C-SPAN TV. After the Fall and his 2007 biography on Dwight Eisenhower, Ike's Final Battle, The Road to Little Rock, and The Challenge of Equality were both Amazon.com new arrival bestsellers. Please join me in once again welcoming Casey Pipes.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's a strange new world that we live in, and but I'm very delighted to be with you virtually. Maybe someday we can come back in person again. I was delighted, 14 years ago to come on the Eisenhower book, and was very warmly received then, and I'm happy to be back on Zoom with all of my friends in Grand Rapids. So I want to thank Brooke and Gleaves for their work at the Ford Library and the Ford Foundation, and their work in sponsoring us tonight. I obviously want to thank Jacob and his team, Allie and Grace. What a great leadership minute that was. Super impressive. And you look at I met some of the Grand Valley kids earlier today, and boy, there's some great leaders that are being raised in this community. So it's exciting to see. So thanks to all of you for being here to talk about Richard Nixon and his post-presidency. So what I want to do tonight for just a few minutes, and then I'll turn it over to Gleaves, and we can kind of do some Q&A, which is probably going to be more interesting anyway, and we can cover different topics that some of you may want to cover. I want to talk a little bit about why this book, how this book was done, and what this book tells us about Nixon and about his post-presidency. So why this book? First of all, as a historian, you're always looking for something new and different, territory that hasn't been plowed before. There have been pieces of the Nixon post-presidency that have been covered. Sam Anson did a book called Exile that came out in 1982, which covered the first 8 years. It was based largely on interviews with contemporaries of Nixon. There were no papers involved. There were no documents he was allowed to look at. Jonathan Aiken, when he wrote his biography of Nixon, which Nixon cooperated with, was given access by President Nixon to some of the documents. But for the most part, the 20-year documents from August of 1974 to April of 1994 have not really been seen. They are privately controlled by the family. They're housed at Yorba Linda at the Nixon Library, but they are not open to scholars. And so I just thought somebody ought to take a look at this last 20 years. And my suspicion was that he was even more active than we thought he was during this time. And most of us who follow Nixon or have read about Nixon suspected he was active, but I suspected there was even more to the story. But I had to get to the papers to find that. And so in 2010, I was able to secure the cooperation of both daughters, Julie Eisenhower Nixon and Tricia Cox. And with Julie and Tricia's permission, I was able to go in and look at these papers for the first time. And that's really how it was done. I did a number of interviews, I think 15 or so interviews, but I really deliberately and strategically wanted to work from the papers. I wanted to go and see where the papers would lead me, what they would show me, and really base the story around what was in the documents. And that was how the book was done. So what did we find out? What does the book tell us about this period of Nixon's life? Well, obviously, it's a Shakespearean story. I mean, this is a political fall in American history, the likes of which we've never seen before. He's the first president to resign the office. He does so less than 2 years after having won a 49-state landslide, less than 2 years after opening the door to China and a number of other accomplishments that many people thought would make him one of the great presidents. And of course, instead, when he died 20 years later, the first line of his obituary began with Watergate. So he falls as far as a human being can fall. And he finds himself in August of 1974 in San Clemente with very little money, very little hope, very little physical health. He's physically sick and almost dies in October of 1974, and he has to figure out a way to move forward. For his own sake, for his mental health, he has to find something he can do useful for the rest of his life. And so he begins the process of sort of climbing his way out of the abyss by working in his office, first in San Clemente, and then later in New York, and then later in New Jersey. And he really executes a remarkable comeback, not politically in the sense that he was never going to run for office again, but in the sense that he mattered again, and he mattered in a very big way, as the book documents. So let me just mention 3 of the changes that I think this book shows that happened during this period from August of 1974 to April of 1994 with Nixon. The first change is this: he changes the ex-presidency. I've said before many times when I'm out promoting this book that there will always be a debate about whether Nixon was a great president. I don't really know that there is a debate about whether he was a great former president. I think he was an outstanding former president. And in fact, in many ways, he really sets the template for what a former president should do. So when Nixon leaves office, there's really no guide for him. If you look at some of his predecessors, with the exception of Herbert Hoover, there's really nobody who went on and did something significant after he left office. I mean, you think about Johnson going to the ranch in Austin. You think about Eisenhower going to Palm Springs half the year and Gettysburg half the year. Johnson wrote one memoir. Eisenhower wrote two. Truman went back to Kansas. I mean, most of these folks follow sort of the George Washington, Cincinnatus model of, this returning back to being a citizen. Nixon doesn't have that option. He doesn't have that option because in 1974, he's got to find a way to actually make money. He's disbarred in California. He's disbarred in New York. He has to find something he can do with his talents and his time. And of course, he also has a deep desire to sort of reestablish his name a little bit and become something of an advisor and a counselor again. And so he really creates this new model that really most of our ex-presidents today still follow. And the new model is, number one, you give speeches, in many cases these days for money. You write books, and you maintain your contacts with navigators in Washington and in New York and in the media so that you can still have an influence. Nixon is, in the 1970s, beginning the process of his rehabilitation by focusing on the one thing that he thinks most people will cut him some slack on, the one thing most people will still want to hear from him on, and that's his ideas on foreign policy. And so he begins the process of his rehabilitation by focusing his public appearances, and there are few at the beginning, but he begins to step it up in later years, and his writings and his books on foreign policy. And he doesn't just write books on foreign policy, he writes books that matter. He writes books that people read, books that become bestsellers. He does media tours where he's showing up in the 1980s routinely on shows like Meet the Press and talking about current events in foreign policy and the Cold War. And he's writing books in a way that will help him have something he can talk about when he's talking to President Reagan or President Bush or President Clinton. So his books, really, above all the other things he does in his ex-presidency, are what begin the process of people taking him seriously again, because he has something to say. He's saying it very effectively, and it makes sense to a lot of people. People still care what Nixon thinks about the world. They still care what he thinks about China and Asia, and especially about the Cold War. And so not only is he active as an ex-president, but he creates, really, I argue in the book, a template that other presidents still follow today. I mean, George W. Bush has got another book coming out next year. Barack Obama just had a new one come out a few days ago with two more to follow. And these are not just memoirs. These are books where they're trying to influence policy. And that very much is a shades of Nixon in that. So he changes the post-presidency. The second thing he changes is he begins to change policy. Even without the levers of power, he is able to use his mind and his insight on the world to change policy. And he does it, as I mentioned, through his books, but he does it also with his relationships. So there's three relationships in the book that I document somewhat extensively, some more than others. One is Reagan, one is Bush, and one is Clinton. The relationship with Reagan, I found in my research, was much more extensive than we realized. He was routinely corresponding with Reagan. He was occasionally talking to him on the phone, and he was even more routinely talking to some of the senior staff around Reagan, many of whom were Nixon people like Len Nofziger, people that he had known for years in California, like Ed Meese, Mike Deaver. These were people that he was routinely checking in with, sending memos with ideas, calling on the phone with suggestions, and having a remarkable impact. So a couple of examples on Reagan. One is sort of symbolic and one is more substantive. So early on in the Reagan administration, Nixon, who has sort of this constant communication with Mike Deaver, who's Reagan's chief communications aide, suggests to Deaver that there's got to be a way to take advantage of Reagan's communication ability, that he's such a great communicator, he has such a great connection with the American people. And so he writes him a note early in the first term, and he says, what if we created, and these were his words, a weekly 10-minute radio address that would dominate the morning papers and allow the president to speak directly to the American people. Deaver takes this idea, loves this idea, and transforms it into the Saturday morning radio address, which I believe continued all the way from 1981, or I think it started in 1982, all the way up until 2019. And it was a Nixon idea. And he, again, it just demonstrating how he wasn't just sending notes to people at the White House and they read them and dismissed them. They paid attention. And in many cases, they acted on them. And let me give you a more substantive example of his influence in the Reagan years. When Reagan begins to pursue the Strategic Defense Initiative, Nixon is very skeptical of the technology. He doubts that scientifically you can actually create a defensive shield that would stop nuclear attacks. However, he is intrigued by the leverage that it gives the president in negotiation. And as you recall, when the Reagan-Gorbachev summits began in 1985 and last really through the end of Reagan's second term, there's a sticking point, which is SDI. At one point, Gorbachev essentially insists at Reykjavik that Reagan give up SDI or the talks can't go forward. And it's Nixon who suggests to Reagan, and these were his words, I feel very strongly that the president could pull a real coup by formally offering to mutually share with the Soviet Union the results of our research in our defensive outer space programs. In other words, use it as a bargaining chip, take the politics of it away from Gorbachev and say, what are you scared of? We'll give you the same technology. You can have it too. And of course, this is exactly what Reagan does. So Nixon is exceedingly successful in his advice and counsel during the Reagan years. In fact, it's much more than I anticipated when I got into it. I will say, as a footnote to the Reagan years, in some ways it worked too well because Reagan, of course, signed the INF Treaty in 1987, or was negotiated in 1987. It was signed in 1988. And Nixon actually thought he gave up too much, which is interesting. So we think of Nixon as détente and Reagan as the great Cold Warrior. Nixon actually thought it was a bad deal, that he gave up too much. With President Bush, the relationship was not as warm and cordial. Nixon was a little more skeptical of Bush. He didn't view him as favorably as he did Reagan. He didn't see the same leadership talent that he saw in Reagan. And so his interactions were less. However, there were some significant moments. One that's documented in the book, which I found in my research, was after the Tiananmen Square massacre, Nixon on his own went to China, met with Chinese leadership, and delivered a very blunt message that the Chinese better knock it off. And coming from the creator of the open door policy to China, this carried tremendous weight. And word got back to the Bush White House that Nixon had said these things, that the Chinese were paying attention, and President Bush summoned him to the White House for a full briefing on it. So there were moments he was helpful to the Bush administration, but it was much less so than the Reagan administration. And he was extremely disappointed and critical of President Bush's handling of the end of the Cold War. He thought he should have done way more to promote particularly the breakaway republics in their move toward democracy. And then finally, the most unusual relationship of all was his relationship with Bill Clinton. And we think of Bill Clinton, we think of Hillary Clinton as being a young lawyer on the Watergate Committee in 1974. And so here is her husband 19 years later. And it's actually Bob Dole who recommends to Clinton one day in a conversation, there's a guy you should talk to on foreign policy that knows more than anybody, and that's Richard Nixon. And Clinton calls him, and Clinton is shocked at how much he enjoys talking to Nixon, how impressed he is with Nixon's insight. And they remained very close for the last 18 months of Nixon's life, talking about particularly democratization in Russia and Yeltsin. And so Nixon, really from 1981 through 1994, is an advisor and counselor to presidents unlike anything we've really seen in American history. And he has, again, a tremendous platform because of his success in his own life, his own career in foreign policy. People, presidents, even a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, wanted his insights because he was so well known in this area and because he had done such a good job during this wilderness time, during this exile time of sort of rehabilitating his name. And these were all much of this was publicly known. It was known at the time that Clinton had summoned Nixon in 1993 to the White House. And again, a measure of how far the comeback had come, that Clinton was not ashamed of that and not embarrassed that that got out in the public. And then the last change that I'll mention, and then we can open it up to glees and questions, really probably the most significant one is just the changes that we see to Nixon himself. He is a much more, in my view, humanized figure during this time. All of the powers of politics have been taken away. He is all alone. Many of his friends have deserted him. And so he has to come to terms with everything that he's lost and everything that he's achieved as well. And he begins to sort of make his way towards some sort of an acknowledgement of what happened in Watergate. I get asked a lot about, did he ever express regret for the crimes of Watergate? And the answer is he expressed regret numerous times, both publicly and privately, but it was always in a moral sense. He would always say to his friends, boy, I really screwed it up. He said to David Frost, I really screwed it up. I let people down. He would say that often to friends, that he morally, he should have done more. He should have stopped this. This shouldn't have happened. But he would never admit criminality. And I never found any evidence that he ever backed off of that. But he nevertheless was humbled by it. And you begin to see, I believe, as the book documents, some of this humility showing in his public appearances. You begin to see some introspection, if you will, as he sort of thinks back on his life and career and how it all ended. In the 1970s, one of his very first public appearances since Watergate was at Hubert Humphrey's funeral. And he got a call from Hubert Humphrey, who was dying. And Humphrey said, I'm probably going to die. And I just want you to know, and I want you to be there. And when Humphrey hung up the phone, he said to the people around him that no president should live in exile. Humphrey wanted there to be a public coming out where people could see that here's a funeral for a Democratic lion, and yet here's a guy that ran against him for president, and he's front and center at the funeral. And Humphrey wanted people to see that Nixon was in fact moving forward, that Nixon should be forgiven, that we should show grace and consider his entire career, not just Watergate. Another fascinating moment occurred about 10 years later, also at a funeral, when Nixon delivered the eulogy for his friend Woody Hayes. I realize we're in Michigan, so I hope I'm not stepping on offending anybody here by talking about Ohio State, but Nixon was very close to Woody Hayes. And he said at his eulogy, speaking of Woody Hayes, quote, he was never satisfied with success, but never discouraged by failure. And again, this is one of the moments where we see Nixon talking about Woody Hayes, but also really talking about himself and his long journey back. When Bud McFarlane, Reagan's national security advisor, attempts suicide during the Iran-Contra controversy, the first person to visit him in the hospital is Richard Nixon. And he stays with him a long time, and he tells him, you'll need an anchor. Your faith is going to get you through this. And he stays in touch with him throughout the whole thing. And then finally, at the dedication of his presidential library in 1990, Nixon told some friends about the time his grandkids had asked him, what name should they call him? Is it Grandpa? Is it Pawpaw? What name is it? And he said, you can call me anything because I've been called everything. So again, we see this sort of humility coming out of him during this time in a way that would have been unthinkable before August of 1974. And that was really fascinating to find and to write about. So in closing, I'll just say that you can really measure the success of these 20 years and the success of his comeback by looking at his funeral. And who shows up in Yorba Linda in April of 1994 to deliver his eulogy but the President of the United States, Democrat Bill Clinton. And it's Bill Clinton who says in his eulogy that it's time to end the days of judging Richard Nixon by only Watergate. So the story is a fascinating one. As I say, it's a Shakespearean one. I don't know that I totally understand the man. I don't think anybody does, but I think I did get a sense of his resolve and his defiance during this period, his determination to become an asset to the country again through his foreign policy advice and counsel. And I think to that extent, he achieved it. And I think he achieved it beyond his wildest imaginations when he was sitting all alone in San Clemente in August of 1974. So with that, I will stop there and let Gleaves guide us on.
Casey, thank you so much for really engaging comments. That's a wonderful introduction to such a complex man. I don't know how you did it in such an economical space of time, but the book is one that is richly textured. I really encourage people to read it, to grapple with somebody, to overcome maybe some of their prejudices about Nixon, which segues into a basic question I have. The name Richard Nixon, you have to realize back in the 70s when I was in high school, starting college, Nixon's name conjured up Hitler and Nazis and fascists, and there's been a hangover effect. A lot of the new left professors who have taught generations of Americans thought that he was truly an evil human being. And the question that arises is that with all of that negative hangover about Nixon and his reputation, tell us how you were able to come up with the idea to write this book. That's a very interesting story in its own right.
Sure.
And furthermore, maybe the more difficult question is how you were able to convince a publisher that this really is a worthy thing that we need to know.
So great questions. So the first one, the origin of the book, it comes from when I was many, many years ago when I was working at the Bush White House. And we had an intern in our office who was a student at Princeton. And she was friends with another student at Princeton who was Chris Nixon Cox, his grandson. And he came down one weekend. I actually toured him around the West Wing. He had never seen the West Wing, which is, kind of, surprised me at the time, but it makes sense. He was born in '79. And it was sort of an awkward moment. I was showing him the Rose Garden, and I was trying to think of, famous events. When you're doing a tour, you want to really pour it on and provide some context and color. So I was trying to think of, this is where Reagan fired the air traffic controllers, and this is where Clinton came out during impeachment. And he was like, yeah, this is where my parents got married. And I was like, yes, that's that too, maybe the most famous event in the Rose Garden history. So just a great guy. We became friends, and he suggested to me many years ago, he's like, no one's really done my grandfather's post-presidency. And of course, as I got into it and started considering doing this, I found out there were reasons for that. There were challenges to doing this, particularly the papers being privately held by the family. But that's where the idea came from. And in terms of, pitching it to publishers, the one good thing about this book is it begins the day he leaves office. So I like to say that the book is sort of agnostic on the presidency itself. I mean, I think a lot of the foreign policy achievements, I think even some of his critics acknowledge were significant. But the book doesn't really, so the book assumes that the reader brings with him or with her a working knowledge of Watergate. The book does not at any point say, here's what happened in Watergate. It just literally starts in August of 1974 and how he's going to deal with the aftermath of it. So I think that really helped. We were offered, we actually, it's funny, I anticipated we would have problems with the publishing world. We were offered fairly early on by Norton. And the only problem with Norton was they wanted it like in, 6 months or something. And I was still going to Yorba Linda and researching. And so Regnery actually gave me an open-ended, hey, you just finish it whenever and we'll publish it. And I'm self-employed. I have a wife and 3 kids. I have to do this stuff at night. So that was a little more appealing to me. So, but we really didn't have, I had anticipated that very problem, but we really didn't have much problem pitching it. And I do think, again, it's a measure of how far the comeback has come. That, people do sort of acknowledge, Watergate was terrible and this was a dark moment in American history, but, what a brilliant mind. I mean, my grandfather, who's still alive, he's 98, is a yellow dog, LBJ Democrat in Texas. And he will tell you, Richard Nixon was the best foreign policy president I ever saw. He was just brilliant. Now, he didn't vote for him. He doesn't like him, but he acknowledges that his mind on foreign policy really had no peer. So no, it was an interesting journey getting it published, but it was surprisingly not as difficult as I'd anticipated.
Well, I know Annette Kirk is one of the viewers this evening, and I think she would be really interested to know the answer to the following question. Maybe one of the reasons that Nixon was so effective as a post-president is that he was really grounded. He was a serious thinker. He was not just a politician. He was somebody who read voraciously. He had a considerable political philosophy in his mind. Could you tell us a little bit about the books that he returned to in the 20 years of his retirement, his ex-presidency, that perhaps regrounded him in his leadership capacity?
So Nixon is very much, I like to say, an introvert in an extrovert's profession. I mean, politics was sort of not a natural thing for him. He was very much a quiet sort of, thinker. And I mean, he would sit in the post-presidency in his office. He had a chair with an ottoman, and he would sit there with his legal pads, the famous legal pads, and scribble just, all day long, ideas and thoughts. He read widely. He read different, typically, history, biography. I mean, he loved anything about de Gaulle. I was mentioning that to some of the Grand Valley students earlier today. That was one of the big loves of his life was de Gaulle. Particularly when he was researching a policy book, Frank Gannon and Diane Sawyer and others who were, working with him would bring him, source material. So when he did his leaders book, they would bring him, Churchill books and, de Gaulle books, MacArthur's memoirs. All kinds of things. But he really was interested in current events. And he, every morning, John Taylor, who was his longtime chief of staff in the post-presidency, would essentially give him a stack book of clips, from news sources in Washington and New York. And that would sort of trigger a lot of the work that would go on during the day. I mean, he would see a story and he would call Mike Deaver and say, well, did you see this? We need to do, we need to work on this. So he would sort of give him a sense of what was going on in DC and how he could be helpful. So he's certainly, I would, in terms of ideology, that's an interesting question. He certainly is not, he doesn't fit very well into a sort of capital C conservative framework. But in some ways, he was something of a small c conservative, in a Burkean sense that, change happens organically over time, step by step. This in some way explains a little bit of détente. It's actually Reagan who's much more idealistic, that we can just win the Cold War and we can just do it, we can get rid of the Soviets. I think Nixon, that was sort of far-fetched to Nixon. He was happy when it happened, but he was also surprised when it happened, as I note in the book. He thought that change would happen much more slowly over time. So he's hard to pigeonhole ideologically, but I think he's certainly in foreign policy, very much from the realism school. American foreign policy should be based on American national interest. And I think he's, there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, this was the one area where I think even today people will listen and be curious what Nixon thinks. And so it's kind of a rambling answer to your question. There's a lot there, but it's hard to kind of sum it all up. I mean, he was, read a lot and thought a lot and talked a lot. And it was a true intellectual. I mean, he really was an intellectual in politics, and that explains some of the awkwardness and some of the reverence and the respect that he had for Reagan, because he saw in Reagan, wow, this guy's great at politics. Like, he's a communicator. People like him. He can shake hands, and he's good looking, and he respected that. Same with Clinton. He respected that about Clinton. And it was a reflection on his own sort of, doubts about the things that he himself wasn't good at.
And I know that Dr. Paul Farr will want an answer to this question, and that is, what about the relationship between former President Nixon and Jerry Ford? Since we're talking from West Michigan, what's developing in that relationship? Very difficult, wasn't it?
It was very difficult. It was very awkward. And I think that began really in office. It was an awkward relationship. It was made awkward, even more awkward by, people like Al Haig sort of staying behind and kind of playing both sides, during the pardon negotiations. Look, he certainly appreciated the pardon. He certainly, even though he, would complain about it, to friends that, I'd rather fight it out and, go to jail. Some of the world's best books have been written in jail. I mean, he would say these things in these moments of defiance, but he certainly knew the pardon saved him a lot of trouble. I don't know. It's not clear to me how much he and Ford ever sort of connected after that. Ford obviously paid a terrible price for it, literally. I mean, paying for it with the presidency. And I think Nixon, to some extent, almost like Reagan in this sense, kind of didn't really always take Ford as seriously as he should have. I don't want to say he was ungrateful. I think he appreciated what the pardon did for him, but it's very hard for anybody to win 49 states, be at the peak of their powers, and be on the verge of all kinds of, Cold War initiatives that he was in the middle of, and have that all taken away and think, well, the guy after me did pretty good too. I mean, it's just, that's really hard for any human being to do. And I think it was probably especially hard for him. He was also, I should mention, he thought Ford was a great president compared to Jimmy Carter. I mean, he thought Carter was completely in over his head. And that's documented in the book as well. So it's really Reagan when he first kind of begins to have a sense that, okay, this is a real leader that could actually do big things, and I could help him from the sidelines. It was one of the more unsatisfying parts of this book for me. I mean, two things I wish. I wish there had been a moment I found where he acknowledged, a little more seriously Watergate. Certainly he did morally, but not legally. And I wish there had been some kind of a reunion with Ford. I mean, I wish there had been some kind of the two of them, talking more. I mean, there's great moments in the book. Ford comes to see him in 1974 before the midterm elections, and Nixon's, dying in the hospital, and Ford comes out of the hospital room with tears in his eyes. I mean, I wish that had been reciprocated, and I don't know that I saw a lot of evidence that it was. And in fact, you could argue there's several moments in the book during the 76 campaign where Nixon is actually probably not very helpful to Ford, including going to China in the middle of the 76 primary. So Again, another long answer, but that's a really great question, and I don't know that anybody has the full answer on that.
Well, a number of people, as questions are coming in, for example, Dave DeBruin, others were asking essentially the same question. A related question would be from Bill McBride, one of our trustees. Kissinger stayed on with Ford. What relationship did Nixon maintain with Kissinger after leaving the presidency?
So this is something that's covered in the book. It's, again, another difficult relationship. Very different, though. Nixon clearly respected Kissinger. He thought that Kissinger was obviously a brilliant strategist on foreign policy, but there was a little bit, and I think Robert Dallek has written about this in his book about Nixon and Kissinger. There was a little bit of a competition going on between the two during these years in terms of, okay, who really was responsible for the foreign policy successes during the Nixon years. And so there's a little bit of a competitive edge to it. Now, having said that, Nixon was not above working with Kissinger, even publicly, when he thought it would advance his cause. So, for example, I mentioned earlier, Nixon was a little concerned about Reagan's INF deal with Gorbachev. Well, he actually does an op-ed co-authored with Henry Kissinger, in which they jointly announce their concerns. And so, he wasn't afraid to invoke Kissinger's name at key moments if it helped him. And they were friendly, and they would see each other and they would talk, but they were very different. Nixon joked at one point in the book about, the problem with Kissinger is, he'll go into a city and he'll go into LA and he'll want to go over to the LA Times and schmooze with all the editors and think that they're going to like him. Well, they're not going to like him, And I think that they were very different in that regard. Kissinger certainly did like to work the press, as we know, but there was certainly a mutual respect, and they certainly maintained their ties over the years. They worked together, as I mentioned, from time to time, even publicly, but still a little bit of competition between them about who was the real genius.
Good. We have a question from our good friend Jason Duncan. He's very appreciative of this presentation. He says, did Richard Nixon between 1974 and 1994 change his views on the partisan competition in the US and either of the two major political parties?
Well, I wouldn't say he changed his mind about it. He certainly saw Reagan, particularly in '84, when Reagan, like Nixon, wins 49 states. He certainly saw that as a big moment for the party to sort of become a majority party again. And I think he, a lot of his advice that he was giving to Mike Deaver and others, Lynn Nofziger, again, a lot of it was foreign policy, but a lot of it was stylistic stuff and things that Reagan could be doing to kind of grow the majority. So he was very much a faithful Republican through those years. Now the Bush years, he gets pretty down on Bush, and he's extremely critical of James Baker, which of course Peter Baker has a new book out on him. He thinks that Baker's not quite as sharp as he thinks he is on the world stage. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the real issue is to some extent the Persian Gulf War, but really the end of the Cold War and Bush's handling of it. Nixon thought he was way too passive, that these breakaway republics, these people that were sort of, trying to start democratic republics, they needed an endorsement from America. They needed support. And he didn't really sense Bush doing enough of that. And then with Clinton, he really, again, he's still very much a Republican, but he takes Clinton very seriously. He sees Clinton as a very, very sophisticated, very bright president, very capable president, and he actually enjoys working with him far better than he did with Bush. So I don't know that he ever changed his views on on partisan politics, he saw, to the day he died, he saw Watergate as a partisan fight. That this was that he was going to go down fighting for his team and trying to protect his guys. So I don't know that he ever softened on partisan politics, but he certainly, with Clinton, was willing to work across the aisle in a pretty big way.
A Cook Leadership Academy fellow here at the Hauenstein Center asks Casey, what was Richard Nixon's view of leadership and who was his favorite leader?
So it's another great question. So he had a number of sayings that he would quote to his staff. One of them was, if you don't get on top of the job's going to get on top of you. He liked decisiveness. He liked leaders that take the initiative. A lot of his advice to Reagan is along these lines of, here's a program you can announce, and here's how you can, take the lead on this and take the initiative. Even with Mrs. Reagan, he's sending her advice on things that she can be out doing. So he views leadership in a very active sense, that it's something that you're out doing, you're making decisions, you're decisive, you're leading, you're defining the issue. That was very much kind of how he viewed leadership. In terms of leaders that he really admired, I mentioned de Gaulle earlier. I think that was probably his absolute favorite, would be my guess. He absolutely revered de Gaulle and the role that he played in defying the Nazis. It's interesting. I get asked this question a lot because of Eisenhower. What was his relationship with Eisenhower? How did he view Eisenhower? It's pretty remarkable. When he does his leaders book, Ike's not in it, which was, I suspect not an accident. So, he had his own way of doing business, and Eisenhower could be a difficult man at times, and kind of an abrasive person as well. And Nixon, famously said that Eisenhower was the most ruthless man he ever knew, ruthless in the best sense of the word, as he said. But they were not close, and I think that I don't know, that fascinates me that he got left out of that book. I looked for that in the research. I was like, is there a note here or something about, I don't want to do Ike because, but I never found it. But that was something that would have been really fun to find.
We've got a whole bunch of interesting questions, Casey, about how Nixon made his living in the post-presidency. So, for example, Grace Tummel, heads up the Cook Leadership Academy, is wondering whether he had a presidential pension. We have an anonymous viewer who's asking whether what kind of money Nixon would make every time he gave a big speech. What do you have to say? What did your research tell you?
So he did have a marginal pension, but the money was made from his public appearances. And of course, the first big one was the Frost interview. He was paid for it. And so he was very shrewd about how he went about this. Now, the books were a huge moneymaker for him. There is some suggestion that, and again, I didn't find a lot of this in my research, but there's some suggestion that, particularly in China, he may have been, advising and counseling companies, doing business over there. But we know he made money on his books, big money on his books, and we know he made money many times on his interviews. And look, he's in 1974. He's basically in debt. He basically has nothing. So that's what leads to all of this activity and all of this effort to sort of create a different kind of post-presidency where, he's got to make money to pay off legal bills and his hospital bills from October of 1974. And so he is highly motivated in a way that LBJ and Eisenhower and Truman weren't. And that's really the model, as I say, today. That's how ex-presidents make money today. They do speeches and they write books and they, advise companies and serve on boards and those sorts of things. But that was all very new in 1974. And he was sort of the first one to kind of figure that out.
The author of Vandenberg, Hank Meyer, is with us this
Oh,
evening.
great.
And he'd like to know what the relationship between Nixon and Vandenberg was. Of course, Vandenberg is gone by the early 50s,
Right.
just when Nixon is really starting to take off in his career.
Right.
But what did you find? Did Vandenberg's name persist into the post-presidency?
Not a lot, but I mean, certainly we know from Nixon's early career, it certainly was something he was very aware of. I mean, Nixon was very much, really all throughout his career, a champion of America on the world stage, a champion of America, um, going into Europe as we did, in 48. I think he saw that, again, going back to his realism. He views American foreign policy as a way to project and protect American national interest. And so if, going into Europe and feeding the people of Europe and getting them back up on their feet, that helps America. And so those were things that were very much, on his mind throughout his career is, where can we use American influence to promote American interest? And so I didn't find anything where he specifically, referenced Vandenberg, but I just know his mindset on those issues. And, he was very much a part of that process. That's the Republican Party's got to get away from the Taft model. That we've got to engage and we've got to be a player and we've got to be a superpower that uses our power, but uses it wisely and uses it to promote our interest. And that's something that, really all through his presidency, whether it was Vietnam or China or détente with the Soviets, everything was calculated on how do we promote American interest and how do we sort of help isolate the Soviets and better position America in the Cold War.
Very good. Well, we're starting to run low on time. I'm going to group a couple of questions, maybe two more questions, Casey.
Sure.
A group of questions that in essence ask the what if, the counterfactual. If Nixon were alive today, this is Ron Modreski asking this, for example, in today's environment, how would Nixon do as a president or as an advisor at a high level to presidents?
It's hard to say. I mean, he certainly would be very concerned about the current president and his penchant for tweeting. I don't think Nixon was nothing if not deadly serious. And I think that he would be sort of shocked at some of the things that are fired off at 3 a.m. On a Twitter account. So I don't know that he would be real wild about that. I do think, I mean, it's interesting, I said this to some of the Grand Valley kids earlier today. I mean, I think Trump sees himself as somewhat Nixonian on foreign policy, that it's a foreign policy based on realism. The problem is it was so clumsily done and just, he's just sort of, jumping back and forth, from issue to issue, from country to country. And Nixon would have thought that was crazy. I mean, Nixon was methodical. He was coherent. He was strategic. Everything was planned out. Everything went in a pattern. There was a process. So I just think the way Trump went about his business, Nixon would not have been very pleased with. In terms of, being an advisor and a counselor, I think he would welcome any president calling him, as we saw with Bill Clinton. I mean, he was certainly happy to discuss issues and give advice, but it's hard for me to imagine, Richard Nixon sitting there looking through Donald Trump's Twitter feed and thinking anything other than this is crazy.
Another group of questions comes from people I think who've already read your Eisenhower book and they've enjoyed this book about Nixon. They want to know what your next book is. What your work.
So it's funny. I was joking earlier. When we did the Eisenhower book, I had just gotten married. I had a wife and no kids. And then in the course of doing the Nixon book, my wife and I had 3 kids. and they are now 13, 10, and 7. And so my life is, those of you who have kids at home, you know what that's like. We're going to select tournaments every weekend and driving all over the place. So my life is sort of in a different place now than it was in 2010. There's a couple of ideas I have, nothing that I've fleshed out. I'm obviously very interested in the second half of the 20th century. I guess I could say that. That's a little bit of a clue. I mean, I've done Eisenhower and now Nixon. So, and again, I'm always looking for like, what is something that hasn't been done? And I have a couple of thoughts on that, but nothing that I've fleshed out and nothing that I've started to pitch to any publishers yet.
Well, Casey, as always, just as when you came into Grand Rapids and talked about your Eisenhower work, as always, you're insightful, you're perceptive, you do your research, your homework. I want to tell our viewers that Richard Norton Smith is the one who first brought you to my attention years ago and said, this is an up and coming author that you're going to want to have. And gosh, for many years now, both the Ford and the Hauenstein Center have teamed up to bring you back. We look forward to your future books so that we can bring you back again. Thank you so much for a great, enlightening, and entertaining evening to hear these stories about Nixon. And I now pitch it back to Jacob to close us out tonight. Thank you so much, Casey.
Thanks, Gleaves.
Thank you, Casey and Gleaves, for that wonderful discussion. And thank you for those questions that were submitted. That was a very stimulating conversation. After this meeting ends, a link will pop open in your internet, and it will provide a survey for this evening's event. So please take the time to fill that out and let us know what you thought about the event and give us feedback for future events as well. And our first event of the winter semester will be on Thursday, January 21st at 7 p.m. when Chief Isaiah McKinnon joins us for our annual commemoration of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Week here at Grand Valley, an event that we're going to be partnering with Grand Valley's Division of Inclusion and Equity and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, Museum and Library. And just a final note, our winner save the date will be landing in mailboxes soon, so please be on the lookout for that. And with that, thank you for joining us this evening and have a happy and safe holiday season.